Historical biographical method, practice 2. Guys, let me just explain some more points related to historical biographical method, that how can you use this kind of literary criticism as the part of your research on literature, right? So why to historically demonstrate that a work reflects its time, right? So why are we required to explore the historical perspective? Of course, we want to comment on the power struggles, for example, among various institutions in the society, and then their role in the production of a piece of literature. So we would be, examining other texts, diaries, records, and institutions which help understand us better the meanings of a particular piece of literature, right? And the point is that we are exploring the history and the historical events and the historical, events and their roles, that how they were playing in the, in the change of meaning, maybe like the, the language which is influencing how the text is interpreted. That could also be, getting changed, right? So such a, a kind of exploration is done in the light of the historical perspective, and we are comparing and contrasting basically. So the language of the contemporaries and then the language of the later generations, that how they were using them, particularly from a literary work point of view, that how that change in language was basically changing the meanings of the text, right? So the language is basically, and such an opportunity is basically revealing a lot of hidden assumptions and hidden meanings regarding a particular piece of literature, that how, the biases and the cultural attitudes, when they are related to different kinds of text or different versions of text, they are evaluated from historical point of view. And such a perspective is basically demonstrating how the literary work shares the cultural assumptions, right? So a literary work might have some cultural assumptions, and those assumptions are taking us to the new meanings of the piece of literature, right? So there is a particular checklist which you can use while doing your research on, historical biographical method when you are evaluating a particular piece of literature, right? So you can use this checklist. Like for example, when was the work written? When was it published? And how was it received by the audience, by the, the authors? And why was the situation in that particular way, right? And one example which I gave you earlier was that once there was a novel which was banned in Pakistan, Lady Chatterley's Lover, right? So what social events were behind that particular novel? So we can just think about any piece of literature or any, kind of social event. It is not necessarily related to only banned document, but that how a particular piece of literature is appreciated even, right? So we can explore as students of literature that what are those social events, what are those, particular historical and biographical events which are active, and particularly while the development of a piece of literature is there, right? So how was the work written? When was it written? And when was it published? And how it was taken? How it was received, right? And why it was received in a particular way. So we are exploring such, processes in the evaluation of piece of literature. Then another checklist is that what does it reveal about the standards, tastes, and values of people, right? So you can imagine that how a particular piece of literature is evaluated, how it is taken, how it is welcomed by the people, right? And how it is, reflecting the taste of the local people, the social attitudes and norms which are there, okay? So another checklist might be, another point in this checklist might be, what social attitudes and cultural practices were prevalent, and what were their roles in the production of that particular piece of literature. The kinds of power relations. So who were the powerful stratas of the society, and what was their impact, their influence in the development of that piece of literature, right? Next point in this checklist is that how do the power relations reflected in the literary work manifest the cultural practices and social institutions? So how are they reflected in the piece of literature and in the stories which are written? Other historical documents can also reveal different meanings about that particular piece of literature. So you can also go through the cultural artifacts and social institutions, that how were they basically revealing something about the piece of literature under examination. Then how might close reading of such non-literary text illuminate about that particular piece of literature? So these are the checklist, and the last point is that how is the past reflected? The second last was that, how is the past reflected? And the last point is that what differences from the ideas and values of the current society are found in the piece of literature? So this is the checklist which you can use for your research of literature while using this perspective of historical and biographical method. And of course, there are advantages of using this historical biographical method. Like the advantage is that works well for some which are obviously political or biographical in nature. So this method actually, it works well for those literature works which are based on political and personal stories and personal biographical movements. Okay, right? And the second point is that this historical biographical method places allusions in their proper classical, political, and biblical background. So those references, those allusions which are used, they are basically studied, and they are interpreted in particular place. And there are, of course, the disadvantages as well. So the disadvantage is that there might be some intentional fallacy on the part of the the critic or the researcher who is using the history or the biography. So that fallacy is also to be checked and to be avoided. And the next disadvantage is that the historical biographical method might tend to reduce the artistic value of the piece of literature, right? Which is to the level of biography, and make it relative to the times and to the personal events, right? And rather than universal, right? So that's one more disadvantage of using this kind of literature. And the example is that Life and Times of Marvel, which is to understand the context of the poem to his coy mistress, right? So that could be evaluated, the poem could be evaluated in the historical perspective of that times of England. And of course, the preferences of the writer about that poem. So these are some of the features which you can use for evaluating your piece of literature while using this historical biographical method.